What started as a typical court session turned into a legal bombshell, as Judges John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett ridiculed Pam Bondi only to be unmasked moments later. You won't believe what she disclosed that led to their stunning collapse. The Supreme Court chambers went still as Attorney General Pam Bondi stepped up to the podium. The major case involving claims of judicial overreach had attracted nationwide attention, but no one anticipated what would transpire in the coming hours. Chief Justice John Roberts looked down from the bench, his face a mix of disdain and irritation. To his right, Justice Amy Coney Barrett reclined slightly in her chair with a barely hidden smirk. The strain in the courtroom was intense even before a word was spoken. "Ms. Bondi," Roberts began, his tone holding the seasoned command of decades on the bench. "I hope you've brought something more convincing than what your office submitted in writing." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience. Bondi, composed in her Navy outfit, placed her documents carefully on the podium. "Your Honor, the evidence we've collected is both thorough and credible." Barrett cut in, glancing at Roberts. "That's not the phrase I'd use for a filing packed with assumptions and weak connections." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. This level of blatant hostility was rare even for the highest court in the nation. Bondi tried to proceed, but Roberts lifted his hand. "Perhaps, Miss Bondi, you can explain why we shouldn't throw out this case immediately for wasting the court's precious time." His tone was condescending, like he was addressing a first-year law student instead of the Attorney General. Bondi inhaled. "If the court would let me present our findings fully." "We've reviewed your findings." Barrett cut in again, her voice biting. "They're little more than conspiracies dressed in courtroom language." Several reporters in the media box exchanged looks. This was getting personal. Justice Sotomayor shifted in her chair, clearly uneasy with her colleague's conduct. "The court acknowledges that you're fairly new to arguments of this scale," Roberts added, his smile not reaching his eyes. "But surely someone in your office could have warned you about the futility of this direction." The ridicule was non-stop. For 45 minutes, Bondi attempted to lay out her case while the two justices repeatedly interrupted her presentation, questioned her ability, and exchanged smug looks that drew awkward chuckles from their clerks. "Ms. Bondi," Barrett said with theatrical patience, "can you point to any precedent, any at all, that supports your rather imaginative take on judicial oversight?" The dismissive tone made it obvious they had already made up their minds. The other justices stayed mostly quiet, some clearly troubled by the odd scene, but unwilling to step in as the exchange grew more hostile. "The American people deserve more than this dramatic spectacle," Roberts muttered, after another of Bondi's attempted clarifications. "This court has stood for over 200 years on the belief that—" "With all due respect, Your Honor," Bondi interrupted, her voice steady despite the onslaught, "I have the floor." The room froze at her nerve. Roberts' eyebrows rose in surprise while Barrett's grin faded. "You have the floor at this court's discretion," Roberts reminded her coolly. "And I trust this court still honors its own rules," Bondi responded, holding his gaze, "including the right of presenting counsel to speak without constant mockery." The gallery held its breath. No one moved for several long beats. "Proceed, Miss Bondi," Roberts finally said, his voice tight with barely checked anger. Bondi gave a small nod, straightening up. The ridicule had set the stage. Two of the country's most powerful judges versus one lone attorney standing at the podium. What they didn't know was that the real confrontation hadn't even begun. The atmosphere stayed electric as Pam Bondi resumed her statement. The initial shock from her challenge to the Chief Justice had faded, but every eye stayed locked on the drama unfolding. "As I was saying," Bondi resumed, her tone surprisingly calm, "this case isn't about party politics or defying judicial power. It's about defending the core constitutional values this court was created to uphold." She neatly arranged her papers, seemingly unfazed by the earlier assault. Several observers noticed her demeanor shift. Gone was any hint of unease, replaced by focused resolve. "In the case of Thompson versus Federal Election Commission," she continued, "Justice Barrett wrote that judicial freedom must be checked by accountability." She quoted, "No office, however sacred, stands entirely beyond the scope of constitutional oversight." Barrett moved in her seat, clearly caught off guard by her own words being cited. Likewise, Chief Justice Roberts, Bondi said, turning her attention to him. In your confirmation process, you stated that judges serve the law, not the reverse. Would you agree that this belief applies across the board? Roberts's eyes narrowed. Miss Bondi, are you trying to interrogate this court? Not at all, Your Honor. I'm laying out the legal principles we all claim to uphold. Her voice was respectful but firm. Unless those principles only apply sometimes, the unstated challenge hung in the air. Several justices leaned forward, now visibly more interested. Justice Kagan glanced at Roberts with a look that gave nothing away. Bondi pressed on, carefully layering her points. She referred to earlier opinions written by both Roberts and Barrett, spotlighting clear contradictions between their past rulings and their current views. In Harmon v. State Department, she pointed out, this court, led by Your Honor, determined that consistent behavior patterns were valid evidence for institutional bias. That precedent feels directly tied to our present case. Observers began picking up on the subtle shift. What had started as a one-sided takedown was morphing into something more even. Reporters scribbled like mad in their notepads. When Barrett tried again to interrupt with a sarcastic quip, Bondi countered with pinpoint citations from Barrett's own former opinions, leaving the justice speechless mid-sentence. Justice Barrett, I'm simply using the three-part test you yourself created in Richardson, unless, of course, that standard has changed. Barrett's cheeks colored as she realized her own logic was now being used against her. Throughout it all, Bondi kept a calm professionalism. She didn't match sarcasm with sarcasm, only delivered sharp legal arguments with steady composure. The contrast wasn't lost on the other judges or the crowd. A buzz stirred among the legal observers. What once looked like a predetermined loss suddenly seemed uncertain. Bondi's grasp of case law, especially from the very justices undermining her, was unexpectedly strong. Additionally, Bondi said, the records we've submitted show a pattern that can't be brushed aside as random or guessed, at least not by this court's own criteria for evidence. She paused, letting her words settle. Unless, of course, those criteria are flexible depending on who appears before this court. The implied question, whether justice was truly impartial, echoed around the chamber. Several justices gave each other anxious looks. The mockery from earlier was now completely gone, replaced by serious, even worried contemplation of Bondi's claims. Roberts cleared his throat. Miss Bondi, you have 30 minutes left. I recommend you stick to your key claims instead of philosophical questions about the court's honesty. With respect, Your Honor, Bondi answered smoothly. Proving this court's integrity is exactly why I'm here. The courtroom's energy shifted again as Pam Bondi reached into her case and pulled out a sealed envelope. Her sure movement suggested this next step had been carefully pre-planned. Your Honors, she said, her tone clear and firm. The Department of Justice has been conducting a probe into certain judicial anomalies for 14 months. Chief Justice Roberts sat up straighter. Miss Bondi, if you're implying, I'm not implying anything, Your Honor, Bondi interjected seamlessly. I'm presenting verified facts. She broke the seal on the envelope and pulled out several documents marked with official DOJ insignia. With the court's consent, I'd like to submit into evidence file JR 7923, which includes internal communications between specific members of this court and outside parties with pending cases. The silence that followed was deafening. Justice Thomas leaned toward Justice Alito, whose face suddenly looked worried. Such material would be extremely unusual and likely not allowed, Barrett said quickly, her mocking tone replaced by alarm. Bondi gave a nod, like she'd anticipated the objection. In normal cases, yes. But these were gathered using a FISA warrant granted by Judge Marcus Wilkinson of the D.C. Circuit, after initial proof suggested violations of 18 U.S.C. Section 201. Gasps spread across the courtroom. Section 201 covered bribery of officials, including federal judges. This is outrageous, Roberts shouted, his face reddening. This court won't be blindsided by unfounded claims. The proof is well supported, Your Honor, Bondi responded calmly, including statements from 2 ex-clerks and digital records subpoenaed from 3 major telecom companies. She set the files on the evidence table, where the court clerk sat frozen. "We also have financial data connecting Justice Barrett and yourself to the Westmoreland Foundation, which actively backed advocacy in cases you both declined to step away from." The gallery exploded into murmurs and hurried whispers. Several reporters rushed out, likely to break the story. "These accusations demand swift justice," Sotomayor began to say, but Roberts cut her off. "This session is adjourned pending examination of these supposed documents," he declared. Bondi declared firmly, "There's more." She motioned toward the rear of the courtroom, where a man in a black suit had slipped in quietly during her remarks. "Special Agent Ramirez from the FBI's Public Integrity Unit brings additional evidence that was only unsealed this morning." Agent Ramirez stepped toward the bench holding a digital tablet and what looked like official court orders. The room sat in stunned silence as he briefly consulted with the court's security staff. "These transcripts," Bondi continued, now turning, to address the entire courtroom instead of just the bench, "contain recorded calls clearly detailing how certain decisions were made even before oral arguments began. The proof was crushing, thorough, and seemingly indisputable. With every document presented, the color drained further from Roberts's and Barrett's faces. What began as ridicule toward a lawyer they dismissed had turned into something no one had foreseen. "The Department of Justice," Bondi stated, her tone now echoing the full authority of her office, "has a constitutional responsibility to ensure that no individual, regardless of title, stands above the law." The other justices appeared just as stunned as the onlookers. Some looked toward their peers with disbelief and shock, while others examined the evidence being handed out by court staff. "Justice Barrett, Chief Justice Roberts," Bondi said, her earlier calm now underscored with a new weight, "these documents confirm probable cause for criminal charges." The trap that had been set so meticulously was now fully activated, and the previously untouchable justices found themselves ensnared by facts they couldn't deny or downplay. The legal showdown had shifted completely, and what followed would depend on how they answered to evidence that threatened not only their careers, but possibly their liberty. Justice Elena Kagan was the first to break the heavy silence that blanketed the Supreme Court. She leaned in to study the papers spread before her, her look solemn. "Chief Justice, these claims seem very serious," she said, her usual judicial calm barely covering her alarm. "We might consider a recess to review these properly." Roberts's face had faded from red to pale. "This is entirely uncharted," he muttered. "The Supreme Court cannot just launch into an investigation. Judicial misconduct falls well within accepted bounds," interrupted Professor Alan Hirschfeld, a constitutional law expert who had risen from the gallery. "The Constitution provides no shield for criminal behavior, even for justices." Hirschfeld wasn't alone. Across the courtroom, legal scholars who had come expecting a regular session began offering their own legal interpretations. "The evidence meets the threshold for at least ethical violations," called Judge Miranda Chen, retired from the Ninth Circuit and respected by all sides. "The next step would be recusal and inquiry." Barrett glanced anxiously at Roberts, their earlier bravado gone. The audience, lawyers, reporters, everyday citizens, had gone from silent watchers to active witnesses in what was becoming a defining moment in American legal history. "Order," Roberts said weakly, but his gavel stayed still on the bench. The authority he had flexed earlier had simply vanished. Agent Ramirez stepped forward again, this time speaking with 3 more agents who had entered quietly. They positioned themselves deliberately around the exits and near the bench. "If I may," Bondi said again, her voice rising above the growing hum. "We also have Miss Rebecca Carlton here, a former clerk for Justice Barrett." A young woman in a gray suit stood up from the 3rd row. "The messages and files match what I was told to erase from the court record in February. I've submitted sworn testimony," she said. Barrett's calm broke visibly. That's not true," she stammered, but the unsteadiness in her voice weakened her denial. The room's energy shifted dramatically. Other justices began to physically lean away from Roberts and Barrett, mirroring the ethical gap now exposed. "I've reviewed the bank records," said Justice Brown Jackson, holding one of the evidence folders. "If these are legitimate, they clearly breach judicial ethics." "They are authentic, Your Honor," confirmed Agent Ramirez, speaking for the first time, his voice calm but certain. The Bureau independently validated each entry. Roberts tried to mount a final defense. This court has rules for handling judicial issues. This spectacle is not how we do things. Those rules, Bondi replied, assume honorable actors. When the top legal authorities are compromised, extraordinary action becomes necessary. The room broke into agreement. Law professors quoting precedent, retired judges citing protocols for ethical checks. Even court workers began viewing the two justices differently, not as icons beyond reproach, but as officials who may have violated their oath. Agent Ramirez moved forward again, this time with clear purpose. He approached the bench directly, not waiting for acknowledgement. Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Barrett, he said solemnly, I need to speak with you both now regarding these matters. The remaining justices exchanged glances, then began filing out, clearly acknowledging that the session was effectively over. As they left, several turned back to look at their colleagues, some with sadness, others in plain disbelief. The courtroom that had seen Pam Bondi ridiculed earlier now witnessed a moment unlike any before, where the country's top jurists faced accusations they couldn't brush off with authority alone. As Agent Ramirez led the two justices to a side chamber, the crowd murmured with disbelief. The entire balance of power had flipped. Those who once held control now stood under the weight of evidence beyond their grasp. The Supreme Court's private chamber, usually a shielded space, was now an ad hoc interrogation room. Agent Ramirez laid a heavy file marked "Classified" on the polished table. Before we continue publicly, he explained, you should understand exactly what the Justice Department has uncovered. With precise care, he opened the folder and arranged 7 documents neatly in front of them, each bearing the official seal of the United States with "Top Secret SC Surveillance Authorized," stamped in red. This can't be legal, Barrett whispered, her voice cracking. The Supreme Court isn't subject to wiretaps. The surveillance was sanctioned under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Ramirez explained evenly. The original targets were foreign agents attempting to sway judicial decisions. Roberts stared blankly at the documents, the usual judicial mask slipping. Those conversations were private, he muttered. Private, maybe? Bondi responded, stepping into the chamber with 2 more FBI agents, but not protected when they involve conspiracy to block justice. She held up the first document. This transcript from April 13th shows Justice Barrett discussing the ruling on Frederick's Environmental Protection Agency case before any oral arguments took place. You stated, and I quote, "We've agreed this needs to go 6-3 to give it proper weight." Barrett's fingers shook slightly. That's completely misrepresented. Then maybe this will help clarify. Bondi went on, revealing the second document, bank statements showing transfers of $175,000 from Westmoreland Foundation to Barrett Family Investments LLC 3, days after the Frederick's ruling was released, exactly as described in your message. The room went still as the weight of it all sank in. Agent Ramirez presented the next file, a chain of encrypted texts between Roberts and outside contacts about specific cases pending before the court. The encryption was advanced, Ramirez commented, but not too advanced to stop decryption. With proper clearance? Roberts looked ghostly pale. I want my lawyer here now. That's your right, Bondi agreed, and we'll make that happen. But these documents are being revealed as we speak in the main courtroom. The American public has a right to know when their institutions have been tainted. In the main courtroom, a Justice Department official addressed the gallery and remaining justices. Large screens had been placed to show the previously sealed files, with sensitive material redacted for national security. What you're seeing, the official told the stunned audience, is proof gathered over 14 months through legally sanctioned surveillance, originally aimed at foreign meddling attempts. The displays showed chat logs revealing coordination between the two justices and outside entities with matters before the court. Financial reports showed patterns of payments masked as speaking fees and book deals that suspiciously aligned with major rulings. Most shocking were the audio recordings, real voices of Roberts and Barrett planning case outcomes regardless of oral arguments or the views of their peers. We'll need Thomas and Alito on board, but that's never an issue, Roberts' voice echoed from the speakers. "The others don't need to know about our setup." In the private chamber, Roberts and Barrett listened to themselves with increasing dread, realizing the scope of the evidence. "How did you get these recordings?" Barrett asked, her legal calm crumbling into panic. "A concerned source inside your chambers," Bondi said plainly. Not everyone agreed with where the court was headed. As the sealed files kept being unveiled both privately and publicly, the size of the scheme became clear. This wasn't random misconduct. It was a deliberate scheme to sway the highest court in the nation. In the main chamber, gathered legal minds and reporters watched, shocked as years of judicial rulings were suddenly re-examined in a disturbing new light. The once confidential documents, now exposed, told a tale of sway and betrayal that shook the very roots of American law. Back in the chamber, tension grew as Agent Ramirez reached into his coat and pulled out two folded documents, each stamped with the seal of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. "Chief Justice John Roberts and Associate Justice Amy Coney Barrett," he began. "I've been directed to serve you these federal arrest warrants based on probable cause for charges including bribery, witness tampering, and obstruction." He laid the papers on the table between them. They carried a weight beyond just paper. They represented a moment never before seen in U.S. judicial history. "This is nonsense," Roberts said, refusing to touch the paper. The Supreme Court is immune from political pressure," Bondi corrected, "but never from criminal charges. No American is." Barrett seemed to process it faster. She glanced at the warrant, spotting the signature of Judge William Harrison, a respected federal jurist known for his strict attention to legal detail. "These warrants were lawfully issued," Agent Ramirez explained, "after showing evidence to a grand jury which handed down indictments yesterday. The files were sealed until now to prevent escape or more tampering." Through the door, they could hear the continued uproar in the main courtroom as the public and press reacted. The illusion of judicial purity was unraveling in real time. Roberts made one final attempt to push back. "This is a constitutional emergency. You can't just arrest sitting Supreme Court judges." "The constitutional emergency," Bondi replied smoothly, "began when judges on this bench sold out their honor." "I've examined the financial transactions," declared Justice Brown Jackson, holding up one of the evidence files. "If these are correct, they indicate clear breaches of judicial ethics rules." "They are legitimate, Your Honor," confirmed Agent Ramirez, speaking for the first time. His tone was calm but firm. "The Bureau has authenticated each transfer independently." Roberts made one final attempt at defense. "This court has systems for addressing concerns about judicial behavior. This public drama isn't part of those systems." "Those systems," Bondi interrupted, "rely on good faith actors. When the highest arbiters of law are compromised, extreme steps become required." The gallery broke into murmurs of support. Law professors referenced case law. Retired judges laid out proper channels for judicial discipline. Even court staff started glancing at the two justices differently, not as untouchable icons but as figures who may have violated their vows. Agent Ramirez stepped forward again, this time with a clear purpose behind his actions. He approached the bench directly, no longer seeking approval or welcome. "Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Barrett," he said officially, "I need to speak with both of you immediately about these matters." The remaining justices shared quick looks, then began to exit, realizing the court session had essentially ended. As they left, several paused, casting looks back at their colleagues, some with regret, others with outright disbelief. The courtroom, which had laughed at Pam Bondi just hours earlier, now bore witness to something unheard of. The nation's top judges facing challenges they couldn't simply dismiss. As Agent Ramirez led the two justices to a side chamber, quiet chatter filled the air. The power balance had flipped. Those who had once ruled unchallenged now faced proof they couldn't manipulate. The side chamber of the Supreme Court, typically a refuge of judicial calm, had become a temporary interrogation zone. Agent Ramirez set a thick folder marked "Classified" on the dark wood table. "Before we continue in public court," he said, "you need to know exactly what the Justice Department has found. With steady focus, he opened the folder and laid out 7 documents in an orderly line. Each was stamped with the United States government seal and top secret. SC surveillance authorized in red ink at the top. This can't be legal, Barrett objected, barely audible. The Supreme Court isn't supposed to be subject to surveillance. The surveillance was permitted under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Ramirez explained smoothly. The original target wasn't the court. It was foreign agents trying to sway court rulings. Roberts stared at the papers, his judicial facade starting to slip. Those messages were private, he muttered. Private maybe, Bondi responded, stepping into the chamber with 2 more FBI agents. But not protected when they involve plots to block justice. She held up the first sheet. This transcript from April 13th shows Justice Barrett talking about the outcome of Frederick's Environmental Protection Agency case before oral hearings even began. You said, and I, quote, "No, we've agreed this needs to go 6-3 to give it proper weight." Barrett's fingers twitched slightly. That's totally out of context. Then maybe this will offer context, Bondi added, unveiling the second file. Bank statements revealing transfers of $175,000 from Westmoreland Foundation to Barrett Family Investments, LLC, 3 days after the Fredericks ruling was made public, exactly as discussed in your message. The room grew completely still as the consequences settled in.